This training takes place during annual 2-week workshops held at the Cultural Centre's head office in the National Museum in Port Vila, which is Vanuatu's main city. At this time, each fieldworker presents their research findings on a particular topic identified for that year's workshop and learns of corresponding customs in other areas of Vanuatu from the reports of other fieldworkers. These presentations are recorded to preserve this important information. The workshop also includes information and programs being developed by fieldworkers throughout the islands to encourage the maintenance and revival of cultural traditions. Most fieldworkers are involved to varying levels in work to transcribe oral vernacular languages into written forms, starting with the creation of word lists and dictionaries that are used in preschool level. Some of the more experienced fieldworkers have been involved in major cultural research and revival initiatives in their respective areas, often with minimal outside support. One of the most common of such initiatives has been the organisation and/or facilitation of performances of traditional ceremonies and rituals, and in particular the reconstruction and revival of certain rituals from living memory as performance and part of contemporary life. Another has been the organisation of community art festivals, which provide an opportunity for the performance of learning of traditional songs, dances, practices and rituals. Perhaps one of the more significant of such initiatives undertaken by fieldworkers is the establishment of community cultural centres. These are available for use by particular cultural communities or clans as centres for community cultural activities and as storehouses and display areas for aspects of their cultural heritage, including old photographs and written records, which copies are made of at the National Museum and given back to the communities. The picture here is of the opening of one of these centres. Nahai is one of the language groups, and this cultural centre was opened by this particular language community back in 1998. And you can see the actual building in the background, but in the foreground you have the ceremonial ground, which is perhaps the most important place for learning and passing of transmission of knowledge. And you can maybe make out the standing slit drums behind the dancers. And this is one of the ceremonies performed at the opening of this cultural centre. Fieldworkers perform an indispensable role as local community liaisons, facilitators and organisers for the program and work of the Cultural Centre. At the most practical level, they organise and facilitate the recording of important rituals, practices, and cultural and historic sites by Cultural Centre staff using written, audio-visual and photographic formats. The recorded material is then archived in the main Cultural Centre building in the National Museum, and copies of relevant material are returned to the community. All recorded material remains property of the traditional owners. And a particularly important part of the fieldworkers' liaison work is to explain the purpose of such recordings and obtain approval and prior informed consent of traditional owners and custodians for such recording to take place, as well as ensuring the participation of the practitioners in the recording activities themselves. Such participation relies on a level of awareness of the Cultural Centre's cultural heritage work, which the fieldworker is responsible for imparting to the community, and which is assisted by weekly national radio shows. We also have a cultural research policy which allows foreign researchers to undertake work with fieldworkers in local communities. So all these fieldworkers I'm describing are volunteers. They undertake their cultural heritage work in their free time. The principal benefit for them of undertaking this work is the status of being a fieldworker, which is now a nationally recognised position as in the language, in Bislama, which is the Pidgin English language that everyone speaks. All fieldworkers are members of the cultural communities they represent, speak the community language, and actually live in the communities. At present, there are probably about 100 fieldworkers. We hope to be able to have one man and one woman fieldworker for every culture in the country. And this is probably one of the best strategies we have for dealing with cultural diversity from within a national institution, where you have to deal with all these different cultures within one nation. Also for dealing with a living and largely intangible culture, and also to affect genuine community participation in the management of their own heritage. However, we are in a developing state. We are a nation state with a government, a bureaucracy and so on. And one of the things we have been having to deal with is pressures for development. The fieldworkers have come up with responses to this. And I want to talk about one of these now, which is a fieldworker from this area, in fact not this area, up the hill, a different language, further inland, a male fieldworker called James Teslow recognised that certain traditional ceremonies in his community were not being performed due to a shortage of pigs. Pigs are the most important wealth item in Vanuatu's cultures. As a result, the intangible cultural heritage which constituted ceremonies was not being transmitted, threatening the vitality of the culture. To remedy this situation, he suggested the establishment of a pig bank, which would provide the required animals. Luckily, we had a foreign researcher working in the area, and we were able to get him to write the project proposals required, and got funding from UNESCO for what was called the Traditional Money Banks Project. By the time the project was written up, it had widened its focus to include all the major traditional wealth items, such as yams, which you saw, shell money, dyed red pandanus mats. And we were able to get partners internationally and funding via UNESCO, via its Intangible Cultural Heritage Program. So we wanted to understand how traditional wealth items were produced, to raise awareness of their significance, develop a strategy for promoting their use, and develop strategies to promote their use in contemporary life, in the, I would say, the westernized sector of life in the country. So we were looking at developing strategies to facilitate the use of food to pay for school fees and to pay for medical expenses at hospitals, because boarding schools and hospitals needed food, right, to feed the students and the inpatients. And instead of people having to sell their products in the market to get cash to then pay these fees, we were trying to short-circuit the system and get them to use food to pay for these fees, thereby allowing them to maintain production in the traditional sphere.